Hello, this is HT Wingnut, and today I'm going to do a quick review of the Acer SA100 SATA 2.5-inch SSD. You can see that right here. It is a DRAM-less SSD, and it's under $100 on Amazon. At least that's how much I paid for it, like $89 when I got this on sale. But I do see it regularly on there for $89 to $100. So we're going to go ahead and run it through its paces. You see it next to a Samsung 870 EVO here. I'm going to compare it with that. Samsung seems to be kind of the top notch of SSDs, and we'll run it through some different file transfer tests and even loading some Steam games and everything. Not much to write about when it comes to the casing and enclosure of SSDs. They're pretty basic, but nice white container here. It's plastic, and I'm going to go ahead and pop this open. I already opened it once, but I kind of broke the case, but that's okay. Just got to get underneath here with a pry tool of some sort. And voila, there's no fasteners holding down the SSD either. So you can see the PCB for this SSD is right here. That's the back side of it. And there's no chips or anything on that side. The other side has all the busyness on it. So you've got the two NAND Flash chips here, and then a Silicon Motion controller chip there, and you can see there's no DRAM flash on here whatsoever. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the details of what we can find on here. Not sure if you can see it up here, but I did get some good pictures of the chips and the information posted on them, printed on them, I should say. So I'm going to go ahead and button this back up and throw it in the computer, and we'll take a look. Okay, so here we are in Windows. I have the SSD installed, but before we take a look at it in detail, I thought I'd show you the product pages for this SSD. Here we are on Amazon. You can see the current going price is $100 US for the 1.92 terabyte drive. Yes, it is 1.92 terabyte, not a full 2 terabyte. If you're wondering why they do that, and I could do a whole nother video on that. You could probably look that up if you want, but in a nutshell, the more free space that the SSD has to itself that the consumer can't access will help improve the longevity of the SSD as well as improve performance generally. So sometimes they what's called over provision the drive, so there's more free space available for the SSD to do its thing. In any case, that's the going price for this drive. Now on the Acer product page, you can see the basic specifications. They don't give a whole lot of detail, but we'll take a look at what they have anyways. You can see here it has a 3-year warranty. Go down to specifications. It's obviously a SATA 3 2.5-inch drive, and they show a max sequential read speed of 560 megabytes per second, a max sequential writing speed of 500 megabytes per second, and it has a 3-year warranty. Go down to the specification page. There's not a whole lot more here than what was on the website, but we'll take a look at it anyways. And it uses high quality 3D NAND, whatever that means. And going down here, though, what you do see is that it has 600 terabyte written warranty, and that means 200 terabytes written to the SSD every year. Once that's exhausted, it doesn't mean the SSD is going to die. That's just what they warranty it to. They test it to so that it's more likely to fail once it reaches beyond that write capacity of the SSD. Although a lot of them I've seen run, not this one specifically, but other SSDs that run generally probably at least twice that terabyte written rating. Now, if we take a look at the actual controller chip for the SSD, I showed that in the video earlier, but you probably weren't able to see the actual text on the chip, so I took a picture of it. Here you go. It's the SM2259XT, and if you pull up the product page for that, you can see that here, Silicon Motion SM2259XT, and it does support QLC and TLC NAND, and the product page for the Acer does not specify whether it's TLC or QLC, so that's unfortunate. And it is a SATA 6 gigabit per second SSD with a sequential read of 560 megabytes and sequential write of 520 megabyte per second. And it is DRAM-less, and we saw on the actual part itself that there is no DRAM chip or for DRAM cache on there either, which is unfortunate too, which means performance can suffer over time. Continuing on, you take a look at the NAND Flash chips. They have this part number on here. And I did Google this in its entirety and also in parts. Didn't come up with anything concrete, so the only thing I can think of is that this is just some generic NAND flash that they got from somewhere that Acer just puts their own part number on it, and solders it to the board and calls it a day. So can't glean any information from that based on that part number, unfortunately. Real quick, taking a look at CrystalDiskInfo for the SSD. Nothing really to see here other than just basic features, that you should see on any modern day SSD. And then the whole smart attribute list that it provides for the SSD. Now I did run a CrystalDiskMark test, compared that with the Samsung 870 EVO, which you see over here on the right, and the Acer SSD on the left. You can see that the Acer didn't fall too far behind the Samsung. It actually performed, probably within 90% of the performance of the Samsung SSD. So looks pretty promising, right? The problem with CrystalDiskMark is it's only really a snapshot into the performance of the SSD. It really doesn't give to show the full performance of the drive across the entirety of the drive. And we'll do some benchmarks to take a look at that more closely. And kind of talking about capacity earlier, here we go. You've got the 1.74 terabyte usable capacity out of the 1.92 terabytes, which equates to 1.74 terabytes binary, and then compare that with the Samsung 870 EVO has 1.81 terabyte usable. So it's a little bit less usable space than the Samsung, but it's advertised as such, so nothing to be surprised about there. Okay, so this next test is hard disk Sentinel, and basically what it does is it writes zeros to all bits on the SSD across the entirety of the SSD, and you can see here that the performance goes from about 425 megabytes per second across the drive until it hits about a third of the way through, and then it kind of goes a little wonky there, but doesn't drop too far down, maybe around 400 megabytes per second. You can also see the temperature during the write process is, starts off at 25°C, which is a little bit above room temperature. Now this SSD was not specifically actively cooled other than the case fan and the PC that it went into. So it basically had traditional, cooling that most people would have in their computers. And you can see here it peaked up at about 52°C, but for the most part it remained between 45 and 50°C, which is okay because the peak operating temperature for this SSD indicated 70°C. Moving on, comparing that with the Samsung, you can see here it ran about 450 megabytes per second, whereas on the Acer you saw it jig-jagged along the way here. The Samsung was pretty rock solid all the way through, 450 megabytes per second. As far as temperatures, it didn't exceed 41°C all the way through the entire test. Now, with that previous test, hard disk Sentinel, this just kind of gives you a snapshot of the data points. This actually records every single data point. It records every single data point. I downloaded those data points and put them in a chart to compare the Samsung and the Acer. So you can see across the top here in orange is the Samsung, and you can see it's a solid 454 megabytes per second write all the way through. And then on the Acer, once it hits about a third of the way through, as we saw before, performance just kind of goes wonky all the way through the end of the test. But if you notice, even though the total average is 409 megabytes per second for the Acer, this first third of the SSD, you can see that it averaged about 423 megabytes per second. The last two thirds, where it was bouncing up and down, averaged about 401 megabytes per second. So overall performance wasn't affected by a whole lot. It's just that you're going to get a lot of fluctuation in the writes when you do that. Now, did the same thing with the reads. The Acer itself showed about 490 megabytes per second all the way across the way here, which is pretty good, and no fluctuations whatsoever. And the temperatures remained at 32°C throughout the entirety of the test for the most part. Pretty good. Compare that with the Samsung, almost identical, about 490 megabytes per second all the way across. And here the temperature was about 33, 34°C. Again, I took the data, dumped it into a chart, and you can see here the Samsung, the orange, and the Acer both averaged about 487 megabytes per second throughout the entirety of the test. So they're pretty much on par. So reads are actually pretty good. The next test is the ATTO disk benchmark. This basically takes different I/O sizes and writes it to the disk, and also reads the data back. So you can kind of get an idea for its performance depending on the size of the files or the size of the chunks, or the size of the clusters. So you can see on the Acer side, you're basically around 500 megabytes per second once you hit 32 KB I/O size, and then you exceed 500 megabytes per second on the Samsung. Now, if you want to go ahead and take a look at the IOPS, on the smaller sizes here, they're almost identical on the write and the reads as well. Actually, the Acer seems to best the Samsung by a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. This next test is basically a PowerShell script that I wrote. It's pretty basic. All it does is it takes a 1 gigabyte file filled with random data and writes it to the SSD repeatedly throughout the entirety of the disk, and then it records the time it takes to record each of those 1 gigabyte files. So it's a pretty intense test. It writes across, it doesn't pause at all during the script, so it just kind of writes until it gets to the end. So the Samsung, you can see here, we reached almost 600 megabytes per second in the orange on average. And then the Acer, it averaged about 413 megabytes per second. Now you can see at that 1/3 point, 600 gigabytes written, similar thing happened as before, right? You get a lot of bouncing going around here. Now in the beginning, you reached about 565 megabytes per second, which is really good. But once we hit this section here, it averaged about 332 megabytes per second. So performance definitely dropped, and you can see it. You'll actually see some bouncing of the performance when you do a file copy too. It'll drop real low, then real high, then real low, which can be kind of annoying. Now, reading those files back, the read performance seems to be pretty good. On the Samsung, we're about 494 megabytes per second. On the Acer, about 422 megabytes per second. Now, there's a little bit of bouncing going on here. I'm not sure what that is. Could be a Windows anomaly. Maybe it's doing an update or doing something in the background. Try to avoid all that as best I can, but it is what it is. But overall, the performance was consistent, which is good, and fairly high performance. Now, this next test is same as the 1 gigabyte file write, except with 10 megabyte file size. So much smaller files, so you're going to have a lot more data points, which is why this kind of looks like a mess, right? It's a lot of noise in here. So let's just go ahead and take a look at the averages and standard deviation here. So on the Acer, on the 10 megabyte file sizes, it actually performed pretty well. 547 megabyte per second average with a standard deviation of 97. And the Samsung Evo averaged about 587 megabytes per second with a standard deviation of 85. So this actually performed quite well with the 10 megabyte file sizes. And on the read side, we had 395 megabyte per second on the Acer and 453 megabyte per second on the Samsung. So small file sizes it actually does pretty well with. Now this next test is basically like the other test, except it takes a folder filled with files equaling about 10 gigabytes in size, and it consists of 1 gigabyte, 100 megabyte, 10 megabyte, and 1 megabyte file sizes. So you get kind of a mix of all the different file sizes. Like the other ones, it'll it will record the total amount of time it takes to copy that file to the SSD. And it is doing all this from a RAM disk too, so there's no contribution from another SSD hindering the performance here. Now, after every 100 gigabytes of writes, so after every 10 folders, the script will pause to give idle time to the SSD for 10 minutes. The reason for this is to give the SSD kind of a chance to recuperate, run some garbage collection, some wear leveling, whatever, to hopefully regain some performance if it needs to. So you can see here these spikes are basically caching at the start of every 10-minute idle time. So we start here, we go 100 gigabytes, have 10 minutes of idle time, start it up again, and you can see here, poof, it spikes and drops back down once the cache has been exhausted, and it continues on. The red is the Samsung. You can see here that it's pretty consistent all the way across the board here, and averages 512 megabytes per second. And then the Acer does fine again the first 600 gigabytes, but then it crashes again, and we end up with overall average of about 365 megabytes per second. And in the beginning here, we have 483 megabytes per second, but in this part where it bounces up and down, it averages about 305 megabytes per second. So after every 10-minute idle time, it seems like it regains a little bit of performance, but then it can only make it about 30, maybe 40 gigabytes, and then it just drops down again. So that's not too good. Okay, so for this last test, the thought was, okay, At 600 gigabytes, the drive seems to struggle. So maybe it's just because I'm hitting it too hard, right? So I said, okay, let's write 600 gigabytes of files, basically writing those 10 gigabyte folders. Write it for 600 gigabytes, give it 4 hours of idle time. So basically it's sitting there doing absolutely nothing. So it gives the drive time to do whatever cleanup operations it needs to, and then go back and continue the test. So basically it's done in 3 segments. So write 600 gigabytes of data, idles for 4 hours, starts up the writes again, and you can see here, even though it had 4 hours of idle, the performance really was pretty dismal. I mean, it's a little bit higher than before. I believe this is about 150 megabytes per second across here, but still, that's about the performance of a traditional hard drive. Then once it hits another 600 gigabytes written, it idles for 4 hours, and then it starts up again, and then this time it actually regains a little bit of performance, but then it tanks down here again. So it doesn't look like this drive can really regain any kind of performance after it's been filled to 600 gigabytes of capacity. Okay, there's 2 final tests here, and they're more real-world tests. One is testing a Steam download of a game, and the other is testing a file copy within Windows. But first, the Steam game download. Basically, the concept here is to use the fresh, wiped SSD with no data on it, completely clean. As we saw initially, that the first 600 gigabytes of the data on that SSD, the performance was pretty good, pretty consistent. But after that, performance kind of fluctuated or tanked a little bit. So I want to see if that happens in a real-world scenario. So I'm going to download the game Red Dead Redemption 2, which is about 120 gigabytes in size, over Steam, both as an empty SSD, and then I'll add 600 gigabytes of data to it, then download that again. And I'll do the same thing with a Windows file copy of another file that has about 125 gigabytes of data. Just copy it from Windows, copy, paste, File Explorer, and see if there's any difference in performance there. You will see that I have 1 gigabit internet or 1000 megabit internet, which means about 110 to 112 megabytes per second realistically maximum download speed. But the reason why you see the higher values here is because Steam actually serves up data that is compressed, and then your computer receives it, decompresses it in RAM or some sort of cache file on your system, and then it goes ahead and moves that over to the destination location, which in this case would be the SSD. So your write speeds are actually going to be higher than what your download speeds are typically, especially for a large file size like this. So you can see here, after doing those tests, the blue is basically on a clean SSD, and you can see as it's downloading, the performance here is right around 250 megabytes per second. It does dip down here. That could be due to slower download speed. I don't know. But as I monitored it, it was actually pretty consistent across the board. And then pops back up, and then overall you finish the download in about 17 minutes. Here it shows 17 minutes and 50 seconds is what I recorded. Now after I added 600 gigabytes of data to the SSD, like I said I would do, I went back and redid the same test, downloaded the game, and then you can see here that's the orange, and you can see here it periodically dips down to basically 10-20 megabytes per second, then spikes back up, and it continues to do this all the way throughout the download. You have decent spots along the way, but in the end it took about 30 minutes and 25 seconds to download the entire game. So basically it's 70-80% slower, nearly double the time it takes with just running it on the fresh SSD. Now, interestingly enough, I did a similar thing with just a file copy in Windows. And you can see here the blue line is a fresh SSD. So it's pretty consistent across the board. And for 125 gigabyte file size folder copy, it took 7 minutes and 4 seconds. And then after filling it to 600 gigabytes capacity and then doing the file transfer again, it only took 7 minutes and 40 seconds. So it didn't seem to be much of a hindrance. So kind of head scratching there. I mean, it's good to see that the performance was maintained, but not sure why it exhibited the situation in other tests, but not in this one. But either way, just the file copy test, those are the results. Okay, so in summary here, I have a chart basically comparing all the tests we just talked about, kind of a snapshot of all the results here. And this particular slide is for the write performance. You can see here we've got the tests listed on the left, the Acer SA100 SSD performance here, and the Samsung 870 EVO listed here. And then basically a percent comparison of how much slower the Acer SA100 is compared to the Samsung 870 EVO. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but just a quick rundown. And the artificial test, CrystalDiskMark and ATTO, you can see here basically it was pretty much on par with the Samsung, less than 3% performance overall, slower than the Samsung. When you look at hard disk Sentinel, which is a full disk streaming test, it's 11% slower, but overall it was 409 megabytes per second throughout the entirety of the test. And now when we get to the file copy test, remember, after 600 gigabytes was written, for whatever reason in all these tests, the performance just tanked or oscillated between, a lower, like 150 megabytes per second, all the way back up to 500, 600 megabytes per second. And that seemed to be a pretty common theme across all the tests, except for the Windows file copy test. So just that's why this is split up between first 600 gigabytes of the disk and the rest of the disk. Because the first 600 gigabytes of data written to the disk, for whatever reason, is pretty good. After that, the performance just takes a nosedive. It's not horrible, but it's not ideal, especially with the oscillation of performance. So you can see here the 1 gigabyte file copy is 31% slower than the Samsung, but the 10 megabyte file copy, the smaller file size, is only 7% slower than the Samsung. When it comes to the 100 gigabyte mixed file copy, basically that's writes 10 gigabyte files of mixed file sizes to the SSD, takes a 10-minute idle break to let the SSD do whatever it has to do, and then continues on through the entirety of the disk. Resulted in an average of 365 megabytes per second, compared with 512 megabytes per second on the Samsung, for 29% performance, less performance on the Acer. Now when it came to the Steam download, basically on a fresh, empty, fully security erased SSD, that's where it performed its best in the first 600 gigabytes of the SSD. It only took 18 minutes to download. When it came to after filling up the SSD with 600 gigabytes, it took over 30 minutes to download. So it's nearly double the time it took when 600 gigabytes filled versus empty. But when it came to an actual file copy test, an empty SSD took only 7 minutes 4 seconds for the file copy, and once it's filled to 600 gigabytes, it took only 7 minutes 40 seconds. So it really was not much slower, only 9% slower after it's been filled up over 600 gigabytes. Now when it comes to read performance, generally the performance was pretty steady across the board, and you can see everything here on the artificial tests were basically CrystalDiskMark 9% slower on the sequential reads, 4K random was 4% slower, hard disk Sentinel and ATTO smaller file sizes are basically on par with the Samsung. The ATTO larger file sizes are 8% slower, but it's only 495 megabytes per second, which is really pretty good. And then it comes to the file copy test, read test. You can see here the Acer is 15% slower than the Samsung and 13% slower than the Samsung for the smaller 10 megabyte file copy test. So that's about it. Whether this is a good bargain for you or not, I guess that's up to you. But I hope this information was helpful. And until next time, talk to you later.